I can't really relate to being the Beatles and being that famous, but I can relate to Brian Epstein. If it wasn't for him, we might not even know about the Beatles. The hardest part of the job was all the research. With 130 pages, I had a lot of room to experiment. I started my career about 20 years ago. I was in college at the Savannah College of Art and Design, and I had a good friend in my one of my classes, and he knew some of the big guys in the industry at the time. Like he knew Adam Hughes, Brian Stelfreeze, Dave Johnson, and so he took me to their studio, and I brought copies of my work. And one of the guys in the studio, Cully Hamner, had a job that he couldn't take because he got another job at DC Comics. So, ironically, the job was at Dark Horse Comics. So it was a short story called The Chairman. So Cully talked to Randy Stradley at Dark Horse, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't have time to do this story, but there's this guy, Andrew Robinson. He's in college right now, but he's really good. And he'd like to do the story." So, like my senior year in college, I did The Chairman, and I finished that story, and then I got another short story, A Breath of Fresh Air. And then I started getting work at DC, and I also did Magic the Gathering, like fantasy role-playing artwork. And then I joined the Jolly Roger studio about 15 years ago, and I started painting covers for Starman and also Hawkman, the JSA, Star Wars, Batman, Superman, X-Men. As far as the fifth Beatle goes, my good friend is also my agent, Mark Irwin. So he came to me with this project and he said, "Would you like to do a graphic novel about the Beatles?" And of course I was very excited just to be associated with a group as famous and iconic as the Beatles. And then as I got into the story, I was even more interested to realize it's a story about, a very personal story about, one man, the guy behind the Beatles, Brian Epstein. And I was very excited to tell his story, which is, like the Beatles is a big story, but his story is kind of like a little personal story. And I found that very emotional because I'd also dealt with tragedy in my own life. I lost some friends at a very young age, and here it is, a story about this man who does so much in so little time, and if it wasn't for him, we might not even know about the Beatles. The hardest part of the job was all the research. I had to study up on like 1961, 1962, 63, 64, 65, 66. And each year, like the styles, the fashion was changing, haircuts. The Beatles themselves were going through different styles of their dress. Also had to study up on the technology of the time and the cars, the type of telephones. And also study up on how to capture the likenesses for all these famous people like Ed Sullivan and John Kennedy, all the Beatles, George Martin, Brian Epstein, but not to like just copy photographs, but to try to draw it in my own style. So I tried to like work in between naturalistic, realistic, but also somewhat cartoony, and therefore making it something more interesting for comic book fans. Like traditional just drawing and inking would have been easier, but I think for this project we wanted to do something a little more special, and I definitely wanted to kind of show everybody like all of my skills. So to be able to use acrylic, watercolor, gouache, and some inks, and airbrush, and markers and pens, and then after that, scan it in and take it the rest of the way using Photoshop. So for me, it was like the full experience of everything I could do physically and by hand, but then also mixing that with the digital age and using Photoshop and the tablet and another program called Art Rage. I think each scene was a little bit different. You know, with the color palette might be different, and some of the materials, and even the boards I was using. Like sometimes I used watercolor paper, sometimes I painted on wood, sometimes I painted on gray Canson paper, sometimes I used regular comic book paper, and I even used like some poster board as well. So with 130 pages, I had a lot of room to experiment and try different materials and techniques. I think it's affecting a lot more people because it's a personal story of Brian who's outwardly successful. I mean, like we all know, the Beatles are huge, you know, and they're known around the whole world. But what we didn't know was that he was also dealing with personal problems of the pills, the speed, you know, and also he wasn't allowed to tell anybody that he was gay, you know. And so it's kind of sad that this man who's trying to bring so much joy and love to the world was denying himself that love and joy and to give love and have love from somebody. And you know, I think that's what makes it a very emotional story, and that so many people around the world can relate to that, you know. Like I can't really relate to being the Beatles and to being that famous, but I can relate to Brian Epstein, you know, because I've gone through times where, you know, I've had my heart broken and I wanted love and couldn't have it, and so I think there's a personal thing that we as human beings we can relate to, and that's what makes the story so beautiful. I think my favorite scene is John Lennon and Brian Epstein on the beach in Spain. Because it's like a nice scene to sort of illustrate their friendship, but also it's a bit of honesty where John gets Brian to admit, you know, that he's gay, and then John can tell him like, hey, I'm your friend, and that's okay. Like, I don't judge you, you know, I understand, and that's cool. You're welcome. Obrigado.